Let's get started. We're going to have to do some pretty serious strip down on this thing, although having a quick release tail really helps. Voila. Okay, took the battery out already. Gas tank has almost no gas left in it. There we go. Oh, nice and light. Okay, what we might do is check the rear bank first, because I still have to finish this behemoth. Fixed all the electrical problems on that thing. Poor thing was a mess. See what those plugs look like. Not bad. Not bad at all. And of course the beauty of recording everything is I can always go back, look at exactly what screws went where. Those don't have to come out, but I will check the airbox. If you tighten down the filter with that wrench, it gets really tight. The threads on the filter are holding it to the engine. Then the engine gets hot. The filter expands in 3 dimensions. It doesn't just get longer or just get wider. Yes, the other little issue called thermal expansion. If you crank down on the filter, then it gets nice and tight. But then when the engine gets hot, hot oil flows through the filter the metal in the filter expands, and if the filter is already really tight, it has nowhere left to expand to. Take care of that later. So the filter is trying to get longer, but it can't. There's no expansion room left in the rubber seal. A little bit of dirt. So it expands linearly, like it literally gets longer. It has nowhere left to go. It actually starts to strip the threads in the filter. So these threads start ripping because that thermal expansion is not going to just relax. So when the threads start stripping, the filter's grip on the oil feed line starts to get weaker and weaker. Now, yes, it could be possible to make that filter stronger, but then of course you've got to make it heavier, more expensive. Better to just install it in the way the manufacturer recommends. And like I said, I installed K&N exclusively at a shop for God only knows how many months worth of work. Hundreds, thousands of man hours spent installing K&N filters. I'd see the same bikes come back over and over for another oil and filter change. Same filter that I installed was on there. Never had a problem. But then I hear people having problems with K&N filters. I even saw one up close and personal. And I asked the owner, hey, who installed the filter? I did, he said. I said, how did you do it? He says, well, with a wrench. What else would you use? Anyway, I digress. Yeah, so anyway, that's metal expansion. Don't crank your K&N filter down with that nut, with a wrench on that nut. It's there for removing the filter, not installing it. How many times have I done that on my bike? I hear people asking. Well, actually, this bike only gets used on the track, which is a great opportunity to change the oil every other time I ride it, literally. I go to the track with a brand new fresh oil and filter. I ride all day teaching on the track. I then ride the following day and then come home, change the oil and change the filter. So usually I get about 100 miles per day at the track. So I change my oil about every 200 miles. And if I can't get the E&I oil, I use the best stuff I can get. So I've used Motul a bunch of times, and E&I, and I think there was one time I used Honda oil, but I was also tracking the progress for shifting. So I was logging every time I was at the track and keeping track of how easy it was to shift And I found that the 0W40 really helped. Yeah, so the 0W40 oil made a huge improvement in shifting. So that's all I've ever used ever since. It goes in there like that. Looking nice and clean. So, where was I? Yes, metal expansion. This whole effort right here now is all for that purpose. I actually get a lot of people asking me, my engine's 50,000 miles old, should I get a valve adjust? And I say, well, when was the last time you had one done? Never. Is your bike easy to start? You know what? It's not. It sometimes takes a couple of cranks. Sometimes takes 5 or 10 seconds for it to actually start up. Okay, well, that's a key factor. A key indicator, I should say. Because the valves are not either opening enough or closing enough, it can sometimes take a little extra motivation to get the engine to crank over. And then, what I really like to hear is someone who says, why do I need a valve adjust? What does it actually do? What is it about the valves that you need to adjust? I love getting questions like that, because it all has to do with, again, thermal expansion. Now the red line on this thing is 14,000 RPM. Just imagine, if you will, those little valves, those are called puppet valves actually, opening and closing that quickly, 14,000 times a minute. If the valves are not opening enough or not closing enough, it's not that big a deal. It's only thousandths of an inch, usually less than 20 thousandths of an inch, but when they're doing it at 14,000 times a minute, that's a lot of space. Air is flowing through those valves, but if they're not opening all the way, yeah, it's only a few thousandths of an inch, but it's doing it that quickly. It actually has a significant effect on overall air flow. And remember, an engine is just a big old air pump. The more air it can get in and out, the more power it can develop. So if you're restricting the amount of air that's coming in and out of the engine, then you're losing power. It doesn't have to be a lot for it to be noticeable. And the biggest cause of that is when valves are not quite opening enough. What else do we have? Breather hose, fuel hose. Ah yes, there's the can connector. CAN for controller area network. Main connector. Anyway, yeah, so what happens is you have to allow a little bit of free play in your valves, because when the engine's cold, the valves are a certain length. When your engine gets hot, the valves grow, they get longer. We have to adjust those valves so that the gap between them when they're cold doesn't close up completely. If the valve doesn't come closed all the way, especially on the exhaust valves, then that exhaust valve doesn't touch against the cylinder head. To illustrate my point, this is actually a cylinder head from an RSV4, just like this one. Same year model, same spec and everything. Those are the valves. These are the exhaust valves. These are the inlet valves. Inlets are always larger because the volume of burnt gas is smaller. We'll see more of this later, but that's the top of the valve right there. I might pull this off just so you can see what the valve looks like. And there's the adjuster shim in there. Actually, no, that's no. Oh, that's right, I took these out because this engine is destroyed. Okay, the key issue is the exhaust valve has got to come into contact with the cylinder head, because the cylinder head has a lot of coolant flowing through it. Nice chilly coolant that's just come from the radiator. And that coolant will literally suck the heat out of that valve if the valve comes into contact with the cylinder head. If that valve has grown so much and there's no room for expansion, it will literally be pressed off the cylinder head. It won't be able to touch it. Ooh, pop. So yeah, that's that coolant running through the cylinder head cools down that exhaust valve every time it closes, if it's adjusted correctly. If it's not adjusted correctly, that exhaust valve won't get the benefit of that coolant. There, that one there. The valve will get so hot that the properties of the metal will actually change. Interestingly, when aluminum reaches the temperature of boiling water, its physical properties begin to be compromised. It loses strength and it becomes more ductile. That's just aluminum. These exhaust valves, I do believe, are stainless steel, so of course it has a much greater resistance to heat, but stainless steel cannot withstand the temperatures of combustion forever. So you often hear about burnt valves. You think, what? Valves are metal. How can metal burn? Well, after a while, with the extreme heat of combustion, and remember, with a 4-stroke engine, it's firing every other stroke. So if at 14,000 RPM, each of those exhaust valves is getting a blast of hot combustion gases 7,000 times a minute. And if those exhaust valves never get a chance to touch the relatively cool cylinder head, they can never get rid of that heat. so that it just builds up and they get hotter and hotter and hotter, and then eventually something will happen that we don't like. And yeah, serious problems can result. So that's why we're doing this right now. We are going to check to see what the gap is between the cam and the top of the valve adjuster bucket. It needs to be a certain distance, and if that distance has closed up, because literally that's the cylinder head, this is the valve, over time, because the cylinder, because the valve hits the cylinder so many times, the valve, as we've said, is stainless steel, the cylinder head is aluminum. So even though there's a ring of a hard metal pressed into the aluminum, the valve closes up against that, sometimes beryllium, but that ring can still hammer itself up into the aluminum cylinder head. So every time the valve closes, it does so hard with the force of those springs, and over time that beryllium ring literally goes up. I've seen it happen on a couple of, well, on one of my bikes especially. The beryllium, I think it was a stainless steel valve seat on that one, because that was back, it's an older bike. But it literally hammered itself up into the cylinder head and required a lot of work. So that is why we check to make sure that the valves are adjusted the way they should be. So let's put some paper towels down here so we don't drop anything in there. That would be somewhat disastrous, although not the end of the world. It'd be a good opportunity to pull the engine open and take a look and see if everything's okay. Okay, so this bike has 3,500 miles on it. Oh, I don't have the battery in it, or I could show you. 3,500 miles. I think, yeah, all but the first 100 miles have been on the track. So that's not always pushing hard. I mean, I do most of my riding is just teaching. So I'm pushing maybe anywhere from 25 to 75% effort. But, you know, sometimes I'm trying hard to catch up to somebody. So, yeah, I don't always ride it like a granny, but sometimes. But anyway, 3,400 miles of pretty hard track use. Okay. Now by pulling the spark plugs out, we no longer have any compression. That means we can turn the engine over easily. We need to do that to get the camshafts to the correct position in order to measure the space between the top of the valve and the bottom of the cam. So to turn the crank, we're going to pull this cover, and there's a socket underneath there. Now, this is, of course, as I mentioned, dependent on the clearances between the bottom of the cam profile and the top of the valve. Last time I checked at 2,000 miles, two of them were on the borderline. I could have adjusted them to get them back to within spec if I had unlimited time. But yeah, at the time it wasn't critical, so I left them. I'm assuming that by now they are outside of the minimum spec and do need to be adjusted. But the possibility exists that they are not outside of spec. I now have the correct tool to hold the inlet cam in place, because of course the inlet cam is on this side and it's connected via a chain to the crankshaft. There's no room to reach the chain adjuster behind the frame rail, so a tool bolts onto the top of the head to hold the sprocket in place. You slide the sprocket over, pull the cam out, adjust the shims, put the cam back in, slide the sprocket over. The exhaust, however, is driven off the inlet cam with a gear right between here, which you'll see in a second. So I've got all the tools I need to do that work, to make those changes. If it's necessary. It may not be, but I highly doubt that. I'm quite sure it's going to require some adjustment. This is where the table can be really helpful. Okay, so there's a socket, cap bolt right there, connected to the crank. Oh, and yes, the key critical issue. Do this work when the engine's cold, so that way the valves have shrunk as much as they will.